Every parent knows the terror of not being able to protect their child when danger comes calling. Elena Ward felt that fear cut through her heart like a knife as she stood in the dusty street, facing a debt she couldn't pay and a choice no mother should ever have to make. The giant cowboy Colt Brannigan had come to collect what was owed, and Elena knew she had nothing left to give except the most precious thing in her world. When she begged him to take her daughter instead of her, the whole town held its breath. But what happened next surprised everyone. Instead of choosing between them, Colt lifted both mother and daughter onto his horse and rode away. What made this feared man suddenly become their protector instead of their collector? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun had barely crested the mountains when Elena Ward opened Thomas's leather-bound journal for what she hoped would be the last time. The worn pages told a story she knew by heart, now a chronicle of failed investments, mounting debts, and dreams that had crumbled like old parchment. Her husband had been a dreamer, always chasing the next opportunity that would make their fortune. Instead, he had left her with obligations that stretched across 3 counties and creditors who grew less patient with each passing week. Elena traced her finger along the final entry, dated just 2 days before Thomas's fatal accident at the silver mine. "The Prescott deal will change everything," he had written in his careful script. "Elena and Mabeth will never want for anything again." The irony tasted bitter as yesterday's coffee. The Prescott deal had indeed changed everything. It had left them deeper in debt than ever before. "Mama?" Mabeth's voice drifted from the kitchen of their small cabin on the outskirts of Coyote Bend. At 14, she carried herself with the premature wisdom that came from watching her mother struggle to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. "Should I start the washing?" Elena closed the journal and tucked it back into the wooden crate that held what remained of Thomas's effects. "Not yet, sweetheart. Let's see what the morning brings first." What the morning had brought, every morning for the past 3 months, was the gnawing anxiety of unpaid bills and the constant fear of losing what little they had left. Their cabin sat on 2 acres that Thomas had bought with borrowed money, convinced that the proximity to the silver mine would make the land valuable. Now the mine was closed, the land was worthless, and the bank in Prescott was demanding payment on a loan that might as well have been for the moon itself. Elena walked to the window and gazed out at the dusty road that led into town. Somewhere out there, she knew, were men who would come calling soon. She had received word that Colt Brannigan was riding through the territory, settling accounts for various creditors. The name alone was enough to make grown men nervous. Standing 6 feet and 5 inches tall, with shoulders that could fill a doorway, Brannigan had a reputation that preceded him like thunder before lightning. They said he was fair but relentless, that he never left a debt uncollected, and that he could track a man across 3 states if necessary. "Mama, you're gripping the curtain awful tight." Mabeth had appeared beside her, concern creasing her young face. The girl had her father's dark hair but Elena's green eyes, and lately those eyes held too much worry for someone her age. Elena relaxed her grip and smoothed the fabric. "Just thinking, that's all. About Mr. Brannigan?" The fact that Mabeth knew the name spoke to how small their world had become. In a town like Coyote Bend, news traveled faster than wildfire, especially when it concerned someone like Colt Brannigan. The stories about him varied, depending on who was telling them, but certain facts remained consistent. He was a collector of debts, a man who worked for various creditors across the territory. He was massive in stature and quiet in demeanor, appearing suddenly and leaving just as quickly once his business was concluded. Some said he had been a lawman once, before something had driven him to a more solitary profession. Others claimed he was the son of a rancher who had lost everything in a bad winter and now understood the value of every dollar owed. What everyone agreed on was that when Colt Brannigan came calling, you paid what you owed, or face the consequences. Mrs. Henderson at the Mercantile says he's collected debts from here to Santa Fe, Maybeth continued, settling into the chair beside Elena. She says he's never been mean about it, just thorough. Elena nodded, though the distinction offered little comfort. Thorough might mean different things when you had nothing left to give. She had already sold Thomas's tools, his good saddle, even her mother's silver locket. The furniture they still possessed was more necessity than asset: a couple of chairs, a table, their beds, and the old stove that barely kept them warm on cold nights. The cabin itself was modest but clean, a testament to Elena's determination to maintain their dignity, even as everything else slipped away. She had scrubbed the pine floors until they gleamed, mended the curtains twice over, and kept the small space organized with the precision of someone who knew that order was sometimes the only control you could maintain over your circumstances. "I've been thinking," Elena said carefully, "about what we might do if we had to leave this place." Maybeth looked up sharply. "Leave? But this is our home. Home is where we're together, sweetheart. The place doesn't matter as much as that." It was a conversation they'd had variations of before, but Elena could see the fear building in her daughter's eyes. Maybeth had already lost her father. The thought of losing her home as well was almost too much to bear. Elena reached over and took her daughter's hand, noting how much it had grown in the past year. Soon Maybeth would be a woman, and Elena wanted desperately to give her more than a legacy of debt and disappointment. "We could go to Aunt Sarah in Colorado," Elena continued, though the suggestion sounded hollow even to her own ears. Sarah had her own family to worry about, and barely enough resources to support them. Taking in Elena and Maybeth would be an act of charity that might strain the relationship beyond repair. "What about the teaching position in Prescott?" Maybeth asked. "You said they were looking for someone to teach the younger children." Elena had indeed inquired about the position, but it paid barely enough to cover room and board for one person, let alone two. Still, it represented a possibility, a chance to start over somewhere that didn't echo with Thomas's unfulfilled promises. A sound from the road made them both turn toward the window. A rider was approaching in the distance, still too far away to make out clearly, but moving with the steady purpose of someone who knew exactly where he was going. Elena felt her stomach tighten with familiar dread. "Stay here," she told Maybeth, though she knew her daughter would probably watch from the window anyway. Elena walked to the door and stepped onto the small porch, shading her eyes against the morning sun. As the rider drew closer, Elena could make out more details. The horse was a massive roan stallion that matched its rider in impressive proportions. The man sat easy in the saddle despite his size, his hat pulled low against the sun. Even at a distance, there was something about his bearing that suggested this was not a social call. Elena's hand instinctively went to her throat, where Thomas's wedding ring hung on a thin chain. She had worn it there since his death, unable to bear the weight of it on her finger, but unwilling to remove it entirely. The small band of gold was all she had left of the promises they had made to each other, promises that death and debt had conspired to break. The rider was close enough now that Elena could see his face beneath the brim of his hat. It was a hard face, weathered by sun and wind, with eyes the color of winter sky. This was undoubtedly Colt Brannigan, and he was every bit as imposing as the stories had suggested. When he reined in his horse 20 feet from the porch, Elena had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. "Mrs. Ward," he said, his voice carrying easily across the distance between them. It was a deep voice, roughened by dust and disuse, but not unkind. "I believe you know why I'm here." Elena nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. Behind her, she could hear the soft creak of the door as Maybeth presumably peered out to see the man they had been discussing. Brannigan dismounted with a fluid grace that seemed at odds with his size. Up close, he was even more imposing, not just tall but broad, through the shoulders and chest, with hands that looked capable of crushing rocks. Yet there was something in his manner that suggested controlled strength rather than brutality. I represent several creditors who are owed money by your late husband, he continued, reaching into his saddlebags to withdraw a leather portfolio. The total amount comes to $1,432, plus accumulated interest. The figure hit Elena like a physical blow. She had known the debts were substantial, but hearing the exact amount made her knees weak. $1,400 might as well have been $14,000 for all the hope she had of paying it. "I don't have that kind of money, Mr. Brannigan," she said, proud that her voice came out steady despite the turmoil in her chest. "I don't have any money." He studied her for a long moment, those pale eyes taking in her worn dress, her carefully mended shoes, the general air of genteel poverty that surrounded the small homestead. When he spoke again, his tone was neither harsh nor sympathetic, simply matter of fact. "Then we need to discuss alternatives." Elena felt the world tilting beneath her feet. She had hoped, somehow, that when this moment came, she would find the strength to face it with dignity. Instead, she felt herself beginning to panic, her breath coming in short gasps as the full weight of their situation pressed down upon her. "Alternatives?" she managed to ask. "The creditors want their money, Mrs. Ward. If you can't pay in coin, they'll accept payment in kind. Livestock, property, personal possessions of value." He paused, consulting the papers in his portfolio. "Your husband put up this property as collateral on one of the loans. The bank is prepared to foreclose unless other arrangements can be made." Elena closed her eyes, feeling the last of her hope drain away like water from a broken vessel. She had known this day was coming, had tried to prepare herself for it, but the reality was worse than anything she had imagined. To lose their home, their last connection to Thomas, and the life they had built together, felt like dying a little more. When she opened her eyes, Brannigan was still watching her with that unsettling calm. There was no cruelty in his gaze, but there was no mercy either. He was simply a man doing a job, and she was simply an obstacle to be overcome. "How long do I have?" she asked. "The papers need to be signed today," he replied, "but I can give you time to gather your personal belongings, make arrangements for where you'll go." Elena turned slightly and saw Mabith's face in the window, pressed against the glass with wide, frightened eyes. Her daughter had heard enough to understand what was happening, and the knowledge broke Elena's heart all over again. She had failed as a wife by not seeing Thomas's financial recklessness in time to stop it. Now she was failing as a mother by being unable to provide the security every child deserved. The weight of that failure, combined with the enormity of their debt and the hopelessness of their situation, finally broke through Elena's carefully maintained composure. The tears she had been holding back for months finally came, spilling down her cheeks as she stood on the porch of the home she was about to lose. And it was then, in that moment of complete despair, that Elena Ward made the most desperate decision of her life. Elena wiped her tears with the back of her hand and straightened her shoulders. Somewhere, deep inside, a fierce maternal instinct overrode her despair. She would not let Mabith see her completely broken. There had to be something she could do, some way to protect her daughter from the consequences of Thomas's failures. "Mr. Brannigan," she said, her voice stronger now despite the tremor in her hands, "what if I could offer you something else, something more valuable than this property?" Colt Brannigan shifted slightly, his massive frame casting a longer shadow across the porch. From his vest pocket, he withdrew a silver pocket watch, an elegant piece that seemed incongruous with his rough appearance. He glanced at it briefly before returning it to his pocket, and Elena caught a glimpse of something that might have been weariness in his expression. "I'm listening," he said simply. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs as she formed the words that would change everything. "Take my daughter instead of the debt. She's young, she's strong, she can work. She's worth more than any property you could claim." The silence that followed her words seemed to stretch across the entire valley. Even the wind had stilled, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Behind her, Elena heard Maybeth's sharp intake of breath through the window, but she didn't dare turn around. She kept her eyes fixed on Brannigan's face, watching for any flicker of reaction. The big man stared at her for a long moment, his pale eyes unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note she hadn't heard before, something that might have been surprise, or perhaps disappointment. "You're offering me your child to settle a debt? I'm offering you someone who can work, who can earn back what's owed," Elena said desperately. "She's smart, Mr. Brannigan. She can cook and clean and tend animals. She's learned to do all those things since her father died. She's worth more than this land that nobody wants." "Mama, no!" Maybeth burst through the door, her face flushed with shock and betrayal. "You can't mean that. You can't just give me away." Elena caught her daughter's hands, squeezing them tightly. "Listen to me, sweetheart. This is the only way I can protect you. If we lose everything, we'll have nothing. At least this way, you'll have a roof over your head and food to eat. But I want to stay with you." Maybeth's voice broke on the words, tears streaming down her young face. "I don't care if we're poor. I don't care if we have to live in a shack. I just want us to be together." Elena felt her resolve wavering as she looked into her daughter's eyes. The logic that had driven her to this desperate offer suddenly seemed thin and hollow. What kind of mother traded her child for money? What kind of protection was this, really, except another form of abandonment? But the alternative was even worse. She had seen what happened to women and children who ended up on the streets with nothing. She had witnessed the slow degradation that came with absolute poverty, the way it stripped away dignity and hope until there was nothing left but survival. At least this way, Maybeth would have a chance. "Please," Elena said, turning back to Brannigan. "She's all I have to offer. Take her and call the debt settled." Colt Brannigan studied both women with those unsettling pale eyes. His hand went again to his pocket watch, a gesture that seemed unconscious, as if he were measuring something more than time. When he finally moved, it was with deliberate slowness, like a man making a decision that would echo for years to come. "And what about you, Mrs. Ward?" he asked quietly. "Where will you go?" "That's not your concern," Elena replied, though the question struck at the heart of her own fears. She had no plan beyond saving Maybeth. Her own future was a blank page that she couldn't bring herself to read. "I see." Brannigan was quiet for another long moment, his gaze moving between mother and daughter. "And you believe this is what's best for the child?" "I believe it's the only choice I have left." Something shifted in Brannigan's expression then, a subtle change that Elena couldn't quite interpret. He stepped closer to the porch, close enough that she had to crane her neck back to meet his eyes. Up close, she could see the weathering that years of outdoor life had carved into his face, the small scars that spoke of a hard existence. "Mrs. Ward," he said, his voice so low that only she and Maybeth could hear it, "what if I told you there was another option?" Elena's breath caught. "What kind of option? What if I took you both?" The words hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Elena blinked, certain she had misheard. "Both of us. The debt was your husband's, but the responsibility fell to you. The way I see it, you're both part of the same equation." Brannigan's eyes moved to Maybeth, who was staring at him with a mixture of fear and hope. The girl shouldn't be separated from her mother, and a woman shouldn't have to choose between her child and her own survival. "I don't understand," Elena said weakly. "What are you proposing?" "I'm proposing that you both come with me, to my ranch. There's work enough for 2 people, and room enough as well. You can work off the debt together, as a family." Elena felt the ground shifting beneath her feet again, but this time it wasn't the terrible vertigo of falling. It was something else, something that might have been hope, but felt too fragile to trust. "Your ranch," she repeated. 3 days' ride north of here. It's a working ranch, nothing fancy, but it's got good water and decent grazing. I've been running it alone for the past 5 years, and I could use the help." Maybeth stepped closer to her mother, her hand slipping into Elena's. "Together?" she whispered. Brannigan nodded. "Together." "Oh." Elena's mind raced, trying to process this unexpected turn. It wasn't what she had expected when she made her desperate offer. She had been prepared to sacrifice herself for Mabeth's sake, to send her daughter away with a stranger in hopes of giving her a better life. This was something entirely different. "What would you expect from us?" she asked carefully. "Honest work for honest wages. The debt gets worked off over time, and you have a place to stay while you're doing it. When it's settled, you're free to go wherever you choose. And if we refuse?" Brannigan's expression didn't change. "Then I take possession of this property as the bank instructed, and you're on your own." It wasn't really a choice at all, Elena realized. It was an offer of mercy dressed up as a business proposition. She looked at Mabeth, whose young face showed a complex mixture of emotions: fear, hope, uncertainty, and something that might have been relief. "Why?" Elena asked suddenly. "Why would you offer this? You don't know us. We're nothing to you." For the first time since his arrival, Colt Brannigan's careful composure slipped slightly. Something passed across his features, a shadow of old pain, perhaps, or the memory of loss. "Let's just say I understand what it means to lose family," he said quietly. "And I don't see any reason to break up what's left of yours." Elena felt tears threatening again, but these were different from the tears of despair she had shed earlier. These carried something else, gratitude, maybe, or the simple relief of finding unexpected kindness in a world that had shown her so little of it lately. "We'll need to pack our things," she said. "Take what matters," Brannigan replied. "Leave what doesn't." As Elena turned to go back into the cabin, she caught sight of Mabeth's face. Her daughter was looking at Colt Brannigan with something approaching wonder, as if he were some kind of miracle made flesh. Perhaps he was, Elena thought. Perhaps they both were two people who had been drowning separately, suddenly offered a chance to swim together toward an uncertain but promising shore. An hour later, their meager possessions packed into 2 worn carpet bags, Elena and Mabeth stood beside Brannigan's massive roan stallion. The horse was even more impressive up close, with intelligent eyes and a coat that gleamed like burnished copper in the afternoon sun. "His name is Thunder," Brannigan said, stroking the animal's neck. "He's carried me through more than a few difficult situations." Elena couldn't help but smile at that. "I suppose we qualify as a difficult situation." "I've handled worse," Brannigan replied, and something in his tone suggested that might actually be true. He helped them both onto the horse's broad back, Elena behind him and Mabeth in front, secured in the circle of her mother's arms. It felt strange to be so close to this man who had been a source of terror just hours before, but Elena found his presence oddly reassuring. There was a steadiness about him, a sense of controlled strength that made her feel safer than she had in months. As Thunder began moving down the road away from the cabin, Elena looked back at the only home Mabeth had ever known. It looked smaller from this distance, more fragile, like something that might blow away in the next strong wind. Maybe it was better this way, she thought. Maybe some chapters needed to end before new ones could begin. "Where exactly are we going?" she asked Brannigan. "Home," he replied simply, and something in the way he said it made Elena think that maybe, for the first time in a long time, that word might actually mean something again. The sun was painting the western sky in shades of amber and rose when Thunder finally crested the hill that overlooked Colt Brannigan's ranch. Elena felt her breath catch at the sight, spread out below them. The property stretched across a broad valley, with a river winding through the center like a silver ribbon. Pastures dotted with cattle extended as far as the eye could see, bordered by stands of cottonwood and oak that promised shade in the summer heat. The ranch house itself sat on a slight rise, commanding a view of the entire operation. It was larger than Elena had expected, a 2-story structure built of logs and stone, with a wide porch that wrapped around the front and sides. Outbuildings clustered nearby, a barn, a bunkhouse, corrals, and various sheds that spoke of a working ranch in full operation. "It's beautiful," Mabeth whispered, and Elena had to agree. After the cramped confines of their cabin, this place seemed almost impossibly spacious. "It's home," Brannigan said again, but this time Elena heard something different in his voice. Not satisfaction, exactly, but something closer to loneliness, as if all this beauty and space somehow emphasized his solitude rather than alleviating it. As they rode down toward the house, Elena noticed other details that told a more complex story. The place was well maintained, but somehow sterile, like a museum of ranch life rather than a living home. The windows were clean but curtainless. The porch was swept, but empty of the chairs or personal touches that would invite someone to sit and stay a while. Thunder stopped in front of the porch, and Brannigan dismounted with that same fluid grace Elena had noticed earlier. He helped Mabeth down first, then extended his hand to Elena. His palm was calloused from years of hard work, but his touch was gentler than she had expected. "Welcome to the Broken Star Ranch," he said, gesturing toward the brand that decorated the ranch gate they had passed through. Elena looked around, taking in the pristine but somehow hollow quality of their surroundings. "How long have you lived here?" "5 years," Brannigan replied, gathering their bags from where he had secured them to his saddle. "Built most of it myself." "By yourself?" Mabeth asked, her eyes wide with something approaching awe. Brannigan nodded. "Had some help with the heavy timber, but mostly just me and Thunder here." Elena could believe it. The man radiated the kind of competence that came from years of solving problems with his own 2 hands. But there was something else, too, a deliberate isolation that seemed almost defensive. She wondered what had driven him to build such a beautiful place so far from other people. "Come on," he said, leading them up the porch steps. "Let me show you inside." The interior of the ranch house was as impressive as the exterior, with high ceilings supported by massive beams and a stone fireplace large enough to roast a whole steer. The furnishings were well made but sparse, a few chairs, a dining table, basic necessities, but nothing that spoke of personal taste or comfort. What struck Elena most forcefully was the absence of photographs, personal mementos, or any evidence that this place had ever been truly lived in, rather than merely occupied. It was then that she noticed the empty picture frame sitting on the mantelpiece. It was an ornate, silver frame, clearly expensive and carefully maintained, but it held nothing except a piece of blank paper. The sight of it made something twist in Elena's chest. There was something so profoundly sad about that empty frame, as if it were waiting for a family that would never come. "The kitchen's through here," Brannigan said, apparently oblivious to her scrutiny of the frame. "I've got the basics, stove, icebox, enough dishes for several people, though I've never had occasion to use them all." Elena followed him into the kitchen, which was as functional and impersonal as the rest of the house. Everything was clean and organized, but it felt more like a place where meals were prepared out of necessity rather than shared with joy. "Mr. Brannigan," she said carefully, "forgive me for asking, but have you always lived here alone?" He was quiet for a moment, his back turned to her as he opened cabinets to show her where things were stored. When he finally answered, his voice carried a note of something that might have been old grief. "Not always, but for the past 5 years, yes." Elena wanted to ask more, but something in his tone warned her away from the subject. Instead, she focused on the practical matters at hand. "What would you like us to do? I mean, what kind of work were you thinking of?" Brannigan turned to face her, and she was surprised to see uncertainty in his expression. For a man who seemed so sure of himself in everything else, the prospect of explaining their arrangement seemed to genuinely perplex him. "I suppose I hadn't thought it through completely," he admitted. "I've been managing the ranch work myself, with some help from a couple of hands who come by during busy seasons. The housework, well, I've been doing that myself too, such as it is." Elena looked around the spotless but cheerless kitchen. "When you say housework, I keep things clean and fix what needs fixing, cook enough to keep myself fed. But I'm not much for the finer points of homemaking." Elena felt the first stirring of something that might have been purpose. "I could help with that. The cooking, the cleaning, making this place feel more like a home." And I could help with the ranch work, Mabeth added eagerly. I've been helping Mama with everything since Papa died. I can milk cows and gather eggs and all sorts of things. For the first time since Elena had met him, Colt Brannigan's expression softened slightly. He looked at Mabeth with something approaching fondness. I'm sure you can, he said, but ranch work can be dangerous. You'd need to learn the rules, follow instructions exactly. I will, Mabeth promised solemnly. I'm a very good listener. Elena felt a warmth spreading through her chest as she watched the interaction between her daughter and this massive, gentle man. There was something about the way he spoke to Mabeth with respect rather than condescension, as if her eagerness to help was worthy of serious consideration. For tonight, Brannigan said, why don't you both just get settled? I'll show you to your rooms, and we can sort out the details tomorrow. He led them upstairs to the second floor, which contained 4 bedrooms. 3 of them were completely empty, their doors standing open to reveal nothing but bare floors and blank walls. The 4th, presumably Brannigan's own room, was closed. You can take these 2, he said, gesturing to the rooms at the end of the hall. They're the largest, and they get good light in the morning. Elena peered into the rooms, which were indeed spacious and bright, with large windows that looked out over the valley. Like everything else in the house, they were clean but completely impersonal, empty canvases waiting for someone to bring them to life. Thank you, she said. This is more than generous. Brannigan shrugged, as if generosity was something that made him uncomfortable. Just practical. No sense in having empty rooms when there are people who need them. But Elena sensed there was more to it than that. As they stood in the hallway with its empty rooms and echoing silence, she began to understand something about Colt Brannigan. This wasn't just a man who lived alone. This was a man who had built a home for a family and then found himself the only one in it. After Brannigan left them to get settled, Elena and Mabeth unpacked their few belongings in contemplative silence. The contrast between their former cramped quarters and these spacious rooms was almost overwhelming. "Mama," Mabeth said finally, "do you think he's lonely?" Elena paused in the act of hanging one of her dresses in the large wardrobe. It was a question that had been forming in her own mind as she observed their host's carefully controlled demeanor. "I think he might be, sweetheart. Sometimes people build walls around themselves to keep from getting hurt. Like we did after Papa died." The observation was so perceptive that Elena felt her throat tighten with emotion. "Yes, like that." Mabeth was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Do you think we could help him? I mean, the way he's helping us?" Elena looked at her daughter, really looked at her and saw not just a frightened child, but a young woman with a generous heart and an intuitive understanding of human nature that sometimes took Elena's breath away. "I think," Elena said carefully, "that maybe we could all help each other." That night, Elena lay in her new bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch settling around them. Through her window, she could see stars scattered across the sky like scattered diamonds, brighter and more numerous than they had ever appeared in town. The silence was different here too, not the empty silence of loneliness, but the full silence of a place where life was happening all around, even if you couldn't always see it. From down the hall, she could hear Mabeth's quiet breathing, and from somewhere in the house, the soft sound of footsteps moving restlessly. Colt Brannigan, she realized, was probably having as much trouble sleeping as she was. They were all strangers under the same roof, bound together by circumstances none of them would have chosen, but trying to make the best of it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new adjustments, new discoveries about each other and themselves. But tonight, for the first time in months, Elena fell asleep without worrying about where they would live or what they would eat. Whatever uncertainties lay ahead, they would face them together in this beautiful, lonely place that might somehow become home. Elena woke to the sound of movement from somewhere below, quiet but purposeful, the sounds of someone who was accustomed to rising before dawn. Pale grey light filtered through her bedroom window, and she could hear the distant lowing of cattle and the soft whicker of horses. The ranch was waking up around them, and she felt a sudden urgency to be part of it rather than a burden upon it. She dressed quickly in her most practical dress and made her way downstairs, following the scent of coffee and bacon. In the kitchen, she found Colt Brannigan standing at the stove, his massive frame somehow diminished by the domestic setting. He had already changed from yesterday's travel clothes into work gear, denim pants, a cotton shirt, and boots that showed the wear of daily ranch work. "Morning," he said without turning around. "Coffee's fresh if you want some." "Thank you." Elena poured herself a cup from the pot on the stove, noting that it was stronger and better than anything she had managed to make in their old cabin. "You're up early." "Ranch doesn't sleep in," Brannigan replied, flipping bacon in the large iron skillet. "Cattle need tending, horses need feeding. Day starts when it starts." Elena watched him work, noting the efficient way he moved around the kitchen despite his size. Everything about his actions spoke of long practice and solitary routine. She wondered how many mornings he had stood here alone, cooking for one, eating in silence. "Let me help," she said, moving toward the stove. Brannigan stepped aside without protest, and Elena took over the bacon while he started mixing batter for what appeared to be pancakes. They worked in companionable silence, two people finding their rhythm around each other's movements. It was strangely intimate, this early morning dance of shared purpose. "Mama?" Maybeth's voice came from the kitchen doorway, where she stood in her nightgown, her dark hair tousled from sleep. In her arms, she clutched her worn doll, a battered thing with faded dress and missing button eyes that had been her constant companion since Thomas's death. "Good morning, sweetheart," Elena said. "Did you sleep well?" Maybeth nodded, but Elena could see uncertainty in her daughter's eyes as she took in the scene. This was all so new, so different from their former life, that Maybeth seemed unsure of her place in it. "That's quite a doll," Brannigan said, his tone carefully neutral as he noticed Maybeth's treasured possession. "What's her name?" "Charlotte," Maybeth replied softly, hugging the doll closer. "Papa gave her to me for my 10th birthday. She's getting old, but I love her anyway." "Old things can be the most valuable," Brannigan said seriously. "They've got stories to tell, experiences that make them special. Charlotte looks like she's been well loved." Elena felt her heart constrict at the gentle way he spoke to Maybeth. There was no condescension in his tone, no suggestion that 14 was too old for dolls. Instead, he treated Charlotte with the same respect he might show any treasured possession. "Would you like to help with breakfast?" Elena asked Maybeth. "Mr. Brannigan has been kind enough to cook for us, but I thought maybe we could take over some of the kitchen duties." "I'd like that," Maybeth said, setting Charlotte carefully on one of the kitchen chairs before washing her hands at the pump. They ate breakfast together at the large dining table, which felt both formal and awkward with just the three of them in the spacious room. Elena found herself stealing glances at Brannigan, trying to understand this man who had so unexpectedly become their benefactor. He ate with the same methodical efficiency he brought to everything else, but she noticed that he seemed uncomfortable with conversation, as if the simple act of sharing a meal with others was foreign to him. "The pancakes are excellent," Elena said, breaking the silence. "My mother's recipe," Brannigan replied, then immediately looked as if he regretted sharing even that small piece of personal information. "She must have been a good cook." "She was good at many things." The words carried a finality that discouraged further questions, and Elena let the subject drop. After breakfast, Brannigan led them outside to begin what he called getting acquainted with the ranch. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scents of grass and cattle and the faint sweetness of wildflowers. Elena had forgotten how beautiful the country could be when you weren't too worried about survival to notice it. "First rule," Brannigan said as they walked toward the barn, "is that ranch work can be dangerous if you don't pay attention. Cattle are big and sometimes unpredictable. Horses can kick or bite if they're startled. Even chickens can be ornery if they're protecting their nests." Mabeth listened with the intense concentration of someone determined to prove herself worthy of trust. "What should we do if we see something dangerous?" "Call for help and get yourself to safety," Brannigan replied without hesitation. "No job on this ranch is worth getting hurt over. Property can be replaced. People can't." The barn was a revelation, clean, well-organized, and filled with the comfortable sounds of animals at home. Brannigan introduced them to each of the horses, explaining their temperaments and particular quirks. There was Thunder, of course, but also a gentle mare named Daisy, who nuzzled Mabeth's hand with obvious affection. "She's beautiful," Mabeth breathed, stroking the horse's neck with careful reverence. "She's got a good temperament," Brannigan agreed, "steady and reliable. If you're going to learn to ride, she'd be a good teacher." "You'd teach me to ride?" Mabeth's eyes lit up with the excitement that Elena hadn't seen since before Thomas's death. "If your mother approves," Brannigan said, glancing at Elena. "It's a useful skill on a ranch this size." Elena found herself nodding before she had fully considered the implications. The thought of Mabeth on horseback terrified her, but she could see how much the possibility meant to her daughter. And Brannigan was right. If they were going to be living on a ranch, riding was indeed a practical skill. They spent the morning touring the property, with Brannigan explaining the various operations that kept the ranch running. There were cattle to be moved between pastures, fences to be mended, crops to be tended, and dozens of daily tasks that required constant attention. Elena began to understand why he had been willing to take on 2 extra workers. The ranch was prosperous, but it was also a massive undertaking for one man. "I've got 2 hands who come by during busy seasons," Brannigan explained as they looked out over a pasture dotted with grazing cattle. "Good men, but they've got their own places to worry about. Most of the time it's just been me." "That must be exhausting," Elena said. Brannigan shrugged. "Keeps me occupied." Again, Elena heard the note of deliberate isolation in his voice. This wasn't a man who had accidentally found himself alone. This was someone who had chosen solitude, perhaps as protection against some old hurt. As they walked back toward the house for lunch, Mabeth skipped ahead, her earlier uncertainty replaced by genuine enthusiasm for her new surroundings. Elena watched her daughter with a mixture of relief and amazement. The resilience of children never ceased to surprise her. Mabeth had adapted to this strange new situation with a flexibility that Elena envied. "She's a good girl," Brannigan said quietly, following Elena's gaze. "She is. She's been through a lot this past year, but she's stronger than I sometimes give her credit for. Loss can make people stronger, if they let it." Elena glanced at him sideways, wondering if he was speaking from experience. "And if they don't let it? Then it just makes them bitter." There was something in his tone that suggested he had seen both outcomes, perhaps in his own life. Elena found herself wanting to ask about his past, about what had driven him to build this beautiful, lonely empire in the middle of nowhere. But she sensed that such questions would not be welcome, at least not yet. That afternoon, while Brannigan tended to some business with the cattle, Elena and Mabeth began the task of making the ranch house feel more like a home. They started in the kitchen, rearranging things to be more convenient for regular cooking and adding small touches that would make the space more welcoming. Elena found herself studying the empty picture frame again as she dusted the mantelpiece. There was something haunting about it, as if it were waiting for someone to fill it with memories that might never come. "Mama," Mabeth said, "why do you think Mr. Brannigan lives here all by himself?" Elena paused in her dusting. "I don't know, sweetheart. Sometimes people need to be alone for a while, to heal from things that have hurt them. Like we needed to be alone after Papa died?" "Something like that." Mabeth considered this with the seriousness that she brought to all matters of the heart. "Do you think he's finished being alone now?" Elena looked at her daughter, struck once again by her perceptiveness. "I don't know, but maybe we can help him figure that out." That evening at dinner, Elena noticed small changes in their host's demeanor. He seemed slightly more relaxed, more willing to engage in conversation. When Mabeth asked him about the different breeds of cattle on the ranch, He launched into a detailed explanation that revealed both his expertise and his genuine enthusiasm for his work. "You really love this place," Elena observed. Brannigan paused in his explanation of the merits of Hereford cattle. "It's a good ranch, good land, good water, good grazing. A man could do worse." But Elena heard something more than practical appreciation in his voice. This ranch wasn't just his livelihood, it was his creation, his legacy, his attempt to build something permanent in a world that had shown him too much impermanence. As they prepared for bed that night, Elena reflected on how much had changed in just 2 days. They had gone from facing homelessness to living in a beautiful ranch house, from desperation to something that might eventually become stability. But more than that, they had become part of something larger, a small community of 3 people learning to trust each other, to depend on each other, perhaps even to care for each other. It wasn't the life Elena had planned, but as she looked out her bedroom window at the star-filled sky over the valley, she began to think it might be something better than what she had lost. It might be a chance for all of them to heal, to grow, to become more than the sum of their individual sorrows. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new lessons in ranch life, new discoveries about each other. But tonight, Elena fell asleep to the sound of Mabeth's quiet breathing and the distant sound of Colt Brannigan's restless footsteps, and she felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. 3 weeks into their new life at the Broken Star Ranch, Elena was beginning to understand the rhythm of the place. Each morning brought its own set of tasks and challenges, but there was a comforting predictability to the work that she found healing after months of uncertainty. More importantly, she was beginning to understand Colt Brannigan himself, the careful way he moved through his days, the deliberate solitude he had built around himself, and the small cracks in that solitude that seemed to widen with each passing day. She was kneading bread dough in the kitchen when she heard voices from the yard, Brannigan's deep rumble and Mabeth's lighter tone, engaged in what sounded like serious conversation. Through the window, she could see them working together at the forge that sat near the barn, where Brannigan was teaching her daughter the basics of metalwork. In his massive hands, he held the ranch's brand iron, a broken star design that he had explained represented both the fragility and the endurance of hope. "See how the metal changes color when it gets hot enough," Brannigan was saying, his voice carrying easily through the morning air. "That's how you know it's ready to work. Too cold, and it won't bend. Too hot, and it becomes brittle." Mabeth nodded solemnly, absorbing every word as if it were scripture. Over the past weeks, she had attached herself to Brannigan with the fierce devotion that only children could manage, following him around the ranch and peppering him with questions about everything from cattle breeding to weather patterns. To Elena's amazement, Brannigan answered each query with patient thoroughness, as if Mabeth's curiosity was something precious that deserved careful nurturing. "Can I try?" Mabeth asked, reaching for the hammer. "Not yet," Brannigan replied, but his tone was gentle. "You need to understand the fire first, learn to read the metal. Patience is the most important tool a blacksmith can have." Elena smiled at the exchange, recognizing the wisdom in his approach. Brannigan was teaching Mabeth more than metalwork. He was teaching her to observe, to think, to respect the tools and materials she worked with. It was the kind of patient instruction that Thomas had never had time for, always too busy chasing his next opportunity to focus on the details of daily life. "Mama's making bread," Mabeth announced, apparently noticing Elena at the window. "She says it'll be ready by lunch." Brannigan looked up toward the kitchen window, and Elena felt that familiar flutter in her chest when their eyes met. It was something that had been happening more frequently lately. These moments of connection that seemed to bypass all the careful boundaries they had established. He would catch her watching him work with Mabeth, or she would find him observing her as she went about her tasks, and something unspoken would pass between them. "Your mother's bread is the best I've had in years," Brannigan said to Mabeth, though his eyes remained on Elena. Makes the whole house smell like home." Elena felt warmth spread through her at the compliment, though she tried to tell herself it was simply appreciation for her domestic skills. But the way he said home with a kind of wonder, as if the concept were foreign to him, made her heart ache for reasons she wasn't ready to examine. She turned back to her bread dough, trying to ignore the way her pulse had quickened. Over the past weeks, she had found herself increasingly aware of Colt Brannigan as a man, rather than simply their benefactor. The way he moved with unconscious grace despite his size, the patience he showed with Maybeth, the quiet competence he brought to everything he touched, all of it combined to create an attraction that Elena found both thrilling and terrifying. It had been so long since she had thought of herself as anything other than a widow and a mother. The idea that she might still be capable of such feelings, that another man might see her as something more than a burden to be shouldered, was almost too much to contemplate. A knock at the front door interrupted her thoughts. Elena wiped her hands on her apron and went to answer it, finding a weathered man in his 50s standing on the porch. He wore the clothes of a working rancher, and his face carried the deep lines that came from years of squinting against sun and wind. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat, "I'm looking for Colt Brannigan. Name's Jake Morrison, from the Circle M Ranch about 10 miles south." "He's out by the forge," Elena replied. "I'll fetch him for you." But before she could move, Brannigan's voice came from behind her. "Jake Morrison, what brings you out this way?" Elena turned to see Brannigan approaching, his expression carefully neutral. There was something in his tone that suggested this visit wasn't entirely welcome, though she couldn't imagine why. "Colt," Morrison nodded. "Heard you had some new folks staying with you. Thought I'd come by and introduce myself, see if there was anything they needed." Elena felt Brannigan tense beside her, though his expression remained unchanged. "They've got everything they need here." Morrison's eyes flicked between Elena and Brannigan, taking in details that Elena wasn't sure she wanted scrutinized. "I'm sure they do. Just being neighborly, you understand. Not often we see new faces in these parts, especially not." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Especially not ladies in your situation." "And what situation would that be?" Elena asked, her voice cooler than she had intended. Morrison had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Well, ma'am, word gets around in a small community. Folks know about your husband's debts, about how Colt here collected you instead of foreclosing on your property. People talk." Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, understanding now why Brannigan had seemed less than pleased to see their visitor. The local community was gossiping about their arrangement, putting their own interpretation on what they saw as an unusual situation. "People are welcome to talk," Brannigan said, his voice carrying a note of warning. "But they might want to make sure they know what they're talking about before they do." Morrison raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "No offense intended, Colt. It's just that some of the other ranchers have been wondering if you might be looking to expand your operation, maybe take on more help. If so, there are plenty of local boys who could use the work." Elena began to understand the real purpose of this visit. Morrison wasn't here out of neighborly concern. He was here to assess their situation, to determine whether Brannigan's arrangement with Elena and Maybeth represented some kind of threat to the established order of things. "My operation is fine as it is," Brannigan replied evenly. "Mrs. Ward and her daughter are earning their keep, and their personal situation is nobody's business but ours." Of course, Morrison said quickly. "Just thought I'd mention it. You know how people worry when they see changes in the community." "What changes would those be?" Elena asked, her temper beginning to rise. She had endured enough judgment and speculation over the past year to last a lifetime. Morrison looked genuinely surprised by her directness. "Well, ma'am, it's just unusual for a man like Colt to take in strangers, especially a woman and child. Folks wonder about his motivations, about what kind of arrangement you all have worked out." The implications in his words were clear enough, and Elena felt her face burn with anger and embarrassment. These people, who didn't know her or her daughter or anything about their situation, were speculating about the most intimate details of their lives. Our arrangement is that Mrs. Ward and her daughter work for their room and board while they settle her late husband's debts, Brannigan said, his voice carrying a finality that discouraged further questions. Nothing more, nothing less. If your neighbors have questions about that, they're welcome to come ask me directly instead of sending you as their representative. Morrison's face reddened at the rebuke. I wasn't sent by anybody, Colt. I came of my own accord, out of concern for the community. Then your concern has been noted and appreciated, Brannigan replied. Was there anything else? It was clearly a dismissal, and Morrison seemed to recognize it as such. He touched his hat brim again and nodded to Elena. Ma'am, if you ever need anything at all, the Circle M is always willing to help a neighbor in need. After Morrison left, Elena and Brannigan stood on the porch in uncomfortable silence. Elena felt exposed and judged, as if her very presence at the ranch had somehow tainted Brannigan's reputation. The easy companionship they had been building over the past weeks suddenly felt fragile and uncertain. I'm sorry, she said finally. I never meant for your neighbors to think to assume. Don't apologize, Brannigan interrupted. You haven't done anything wrong. Jake Morrison and his friends can think whatever they want to think. It doesn't change anything. But Elena wasn't so sure about that. The visit had reminded her that their arrangement, however innocent, looked questionable to outside observers. A single woman and her daughter living alone with an unmarried man, no matter how proper their conduct, was bound to generate talk in a conservative community. Maybe it would be better if Mabeth and I found somewhere else to go, she said quietly. I don't want to damage your standing with your neighbors. Brannigan turned to look at her then, and she was surprised by the intensity in his pale eyes. Is that what you want? To leave? The question hung between them, loaded with implications that neither of them seemed ready to address directly. Elena realized that somewhere over the past weeks, the ranch had stopped feeling like a temporary refuge and started feeling like home. The thought of leaving, of taking Mabeth away from the first stability they had known in months, made her chest tight with an emotion she couldn't quite name. The morning came crisp and clear, with the promise of late summer heat building in the eastern sky. Elena had risen before dawn, as had become her custom, to start the coffee and begin breakfast preparations. But today felt different, somehow charged with an energy she couldn't quite identify. Perhaps it was the conversation from the night before, or the way Brannigan had looked at her when he spoke about his former fiancé, but something had shifted in the careful balance they had maintained. She was standing at the kitchen window, watching the sun paint the mountains gold, when she heard footsteps on the stairs. Brannigan appeared in the doorway, fully dressed despite the early hour, his hair still damp from washing. Morning, he said, but his voice carried a note of something that might have been nervousness. Good morning, Elena replied, turning to face him. Coffee's ready. Instead of moving toward the coffee pot as he usually did, Brannigan remained in the doorway, his large frame filling the space. Elena noticed that he was holding something in his hands, something small and delicate, that seemed almost lost in his massive palms. Elena, he said, then stopped, as if her name had caught in his throat. It was the first time he had used her given name instead of the formal Mrs. Ward, and the sound of it in his deep voice made something flutter in her chest. Yes? He stepped into the kitchen, moving with that careful deliberation she had come to recognize as a sign that he was wrestling with something important. When he opened his hands, Elena saw her mother's rosary resting against his calloused palms, the string of pearl and silver beads that she had thought lost forever. I found this in your room, he said quietly. It had fallen behind the dresser. I thought you might be missing it. Elena stared at the rosary, her throat suddenly tight with emotion. She had searched everywhere for it after their move to the ranch, convinced that it had been lost in the chaos of packing their few belongings. The rosary had been her mother's most precious possession, passed down through 3 generations of women who had found comfort in its familiar weight and the prayers it represented. "I thought it was gone," she whispered, reaching out to take it from his hands. Their fingers brushed as the rosary changed hands, and Elena felt a shock of awareness at the contact, his skin warm and surprisingly gentle despite its roughness. "I was fixing a loose board in the floor," Brannigan explained. "It must have rolled back there when you were unpacking." Elena cradled the rosary against her chest, feeling the familiar comfort of the smooth beads. But more than that, she was struck by the thoughtfulness of his gesture. He could have simply left it on her dresser or mentioned it casually over breakfast. Instead, he had sought her out privately, understanding somehow that this was something deeply personal. "Thank you," she said, looking up to meet his eyes. "This means more to me than you can know." "I figured it might," he replied simply. "You've been going to church in town every Sunday since you arrived. Seemed like faith was important to you." Elena was surprised that he had noticed her weekly trips to the small Catholic church in Coyote Bend. It was a long ride each way, but she had felt the need to maintain that connection to something larger than herself, especially during these weeks of uncertainty and change. "It is important to me," she admitted, "though I'll confess, my faith has been tested this past year. Sometimes it's hard to understand why God allows certain things to happen." Brannigan was quiet for a moment, his pale eyes thoughtful. "My mother used to say that God doesn't send us more than we can handle, but he trusts some people with more than others. Your mother sounds like a wise woman." She was. Something shifted in his expression, a softening that Elena had rarely seen. "She would have liked you. She always believed that a home wasn't complete without a woman's touch, without children's laughter. She—" The words hung between them, loaded with implications that neither seemed ready to address directly. Elena found herself studying his face, noting the way his eyes lingered on her lips, the tension in his shoulders that suggested he was fighting some internal battle. "Colt," she said softly, using his given name for the first time. The sound of it felt intimate, personal, in a way that made her pulse quicken. Elena. Her name was barely a whisper on his lips, and she could see the conflict in his eyes, want warring with caution, hope battling against the fear of being hurt again. The moment stretched between them, fragile and electric, until the sound of Mabeth's footsteps on the stairs broke the spell. They stepped apart quickly, both of them suddenly focused on the mundane tasks of morning preparation. But Elena could feel the change in the air, the acknowledgement of something that had been building between them for weeks. "Good morning, Mama." "Good morning, Mr. Brannigan," Mabeth said as she entered the kitchen, apparently oblivious to the tension that still hummed between the adults. "Good morning, sweetheart," Elena managed, her voice only slightly breathless. "Did you sleep well?" "I did, but I had the strangest dream." Mabeth settled into her usual chair, looking between Elena and Brannigan with the unconscious perception that children sometimes possessed. "I dreamed that we all lived here forever, and that you and Mr. Brannigan got married, and that we were a real family." Elena felt heat flood her cheeks at her daughter's words, while Brannigan seemed to find something fascinating about the coffee in his cup. The silence that followed was deafening, filled with all the things that couldn't be said. "Dreams can be wonderful things," Elena said finally, her voice carefully neutral, "but we mustn't confuse them with reality." Mabeth studied both adults with the serious expression she wore when trying to understand the complicated world of grown-ups. "But why couldn't it be real? You're both good people, and you care about each other. I can see it in the way you look at each other when you think nobody's watching." Elena nearly choked on her coffee, while Brannigan's face reddened above his collar. The perceptiveness of children could be both blessing and curse, Elena reflected. Mabeth had seen what they had been trying so hard to hide from themselves. "Mabeth," Elena said gently, "there are many things that complicate adult relationships. Mr. Brannigan has been very kind to us, but that doesn't mean—" "It doesn't mean what?" Mabeth interrupted, her young face earnest and confused. "It doesn't mean you could love each other? Because I think you already do." The words hit Elena like a physical blow, not because they were wrong, but because they were so absolutely right. Somewhere in the past weeks, she had fallen in love with Colt Brannigan, with his quiet strength, his gentle treatment of her daughter, his patient teaching, his careful respect for her independence. She loved the way he moved through his days with purposeful grace, the way he could gentle a fractious horse or fix a broken fence with equal skill. She loved his dry sense of humor and his deep appreciation for the land he had built his life around. But loving him and being able to act on that love were two entirely different things. "Love isn't always enough, sweetheart," Elena said softly. "Sometimes there are other considerations, practical matters, social expectations, the weight of the past." Brannigan looked up then, his eyes meeting Elena's across the table. In them, she saw her own conflict reflected the same longing, the same fear, the same recognition that what was growing between them was both precious and impossible. "Maybe," he said quietly, "we should just take things one day at a time, see what develops naturally, without forcing anything or making assumptions about the future." Elena nodded, understanding the wisdom in his words, even as her heart yearned for something more definitive. They were all walking on uncertain ground, trying to build something new from the fragments of their individual pasts. The rest of breakfast passed in relative normalcy, but Elena could feel the undercurrent of awareness that now existed between her and Brannigan. Every casual touch, his hand brushing hers as he passed the butter, her shoulder grazing his arm, as she reached for something seemed to carry electric significance. Later that morning, as Elena tended to the kitchen garden she had begun planting, she found herself thinking about Maybeth's dream and her own complicated feelings. The truth was, she could envision the life her daughter had described, a future where they remained at the ranch, not as employees working off a debt, but as a family bound by love and commitment. But such dreams required courage, the willingness to risk everything on the possibility of happiness. Elena had thought herself beyond such risks, had convinced herself that the safe path was the only path after the losses she had endured. Now she was beginning to wonder if safety and contentment were worth the price of denying her heart. She was lost in these thoughts when she became aware of someone watching her. She looked up to find Brannigan leaning against the garden fence, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her stomach flutter. "The garden looks good," he said, though something in his tone suggested he wasn't really thinking about vegetables. "It's coming along," Elena replied, straightening and brushing dirt from her hands. "The soil here is rich. Things grow well when they're properly tended." "Yes," Brannigan said quietly, his eyes never leaving her face. "They do." Elena felt the weight of metaphor in his words, the suggestion that perhaps more than plants could flourish with the right care and attention. The moments stretched between them, full of possibility and promise, until the sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their silent communication. A rider was approaching from the direction of town, moving with the urgent pace that suggested important news. As the figure drew closer, Elena recognized the postmaster from Coyote Bend, his face grim with whatever message he carried. "Mr. Brannigan," the man called as he reined in his horse. "I've got a letter for you. Came in on the morning stage from Denver. Man who sent it said it was urgent." Brannigan took the letter with a frown, studying the unfamiliar handwriting on the envelope. Elena watched as he opened it, noting the way his expression darkened as he read. "What is it?" she asked, stepping closer. Brannigan folded the letter carefully, his jaw tight with some emotion Elena couldn't identify. When he looked at her, she saw something that might have been fear in his pale eyes. "It's about your husband," he said quietly, "about how he really died." Elena felt the world tilt beneath her feet. The letter in Brannigan's hands seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, promising revelations that would shatter the fragile peace they had built together. "What do you mean, how he really died?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Brannigan glanced at the postmaster, who was clearly listening with avid curiosity. "Tom, I appreciate you riding out here with this. Tell Marshal Davidson I'll be in touch." The postmaster nodded reluctantly and rode away, leaving Elena and Brannigan alone with whatever terrible truth the letter contained. Elena's legs felt weak, and she sank down onto the garden bench that Brannigan had built for her just the week before. "Thomas died in a mining accident," she said, as if repeating the official story could make it true. "A cave-in at the silver mine. They found his body 3 days later." Brannigan sat down beside her, the letter still clutched in his hands. His proximity was both comforting and terrifying. She wanted to lean into his strength, but she was afraid of what she was about to learn. "Elena," he said gently, "this letter is from a U.S. Marshal named Frank Morrison, Jake Morrison's brother. As it turns out, he's been investigating a series of murders across 3 territories, all connected to fraudulent mining investments." Elena stared at him, the words not quite penetrating her understanding. Murders? Men who got too close to exposing the fraud, men who asked too many questions about where their money was going. Brannigan's voice was carefully controlled, but Elena could hear the tension beneath it. Thomas was one of them. The blood-stained letter that Brannigan unfolded was worn and creased, as if it had been hidden for a long time. Elena could see dark stains on the paper that made her stomach turn, though she couldn't be sure if they were from blood or simply age and weather. "This was found sewn into Thomas's coat," Brannigan continued. "The marshal's office just got it from the mining company, along with his other personal effects that were never returned to you." Elena's hands trembled as she reached for the letter. The handwriting was definitely Thomas's, though it was hurried and erratic, as if written under extreme stress. "Elena," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then my worst fears have come true. The Prescott Mining Company is not what it seems. They have been taking money from investors like me and using it to fund illegal activities, gun running, claim jumping, even murder. I have evidence, but I fear they know I have it. If something happens to me, take this letter to the authorities. Trust no one connected to Prescott. Keep Mabeth safe. I love you both. Thomas." Elena read the letter twice, 3 times, the words refusing to coalesce into meaning. Thomas hadn't died in an accident. He had been murdered. And the debt that had driven her to desperation, the obligations that had forced her to offer up her daughter, they were all connected to his death. "I don't understand," she said finally. "If Thomas knew he was in danger, why didn't he come home? Why didn't he warn me?" "Because he thought he could expose them," Brannigan said quietly. "And because men like your husband always think they're smarter than the people trying to kill them." Elena looked up sharply at the slight edge in his voice. "You sound like you speak from experience." Brannigan was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes focused on something far beyond the garden. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old secrets. "I used to be a lawman, Elena, a U.S. Marshal, working territories from here to California. I've seen what happens when good men get tangled up with bad people. Your husband wasn't the first, and he won't be the last." Elena stared at him, trying to reconcile this revelation with everything she thought she knew about him. "You're a marshal?" "Was," Brannigan corrected. "I retired 5 years ago. Built this ranch. Tried to put that life behind me." "Why?" Again, that long pause, as if he were deciding how much truth to reveal. "Because I got tired of burying good people. Because I wanted to build something instead of just hunting down the people who destroyed things. Because I met a woman who wanted me to choose between the badge and her, and I chose wrong." Elena felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. The careful isolation, the reputation that preceded him, the way he had known exactly how to handle Jake Morrison's veiled threats, all of it made sense now. "That's why you knew about the debt collection," she said. "That's why people are afraid of you. You're not just a debt collector, you're a former lawman." "Word gets around," Brannigan said simply. "People know I used to wear a badge, even if they don't know why I stopped." Elena's mind was racing, trying to process the implications of everything she had learned. "The letter from Marshal Morrison, he's asking for your help, isn't he?" Brannigan nodded grimly. The Prescott Mining Company has been operating under different names across 3 territories. They find desperate men like Thomas, take their investments, then eliminate anyone who gets suspicious. Frank Morrison thinks they're planning something big, a final score before they disappear entirely, and he wants you to help catch them. He wants me to come out of retirement, yes, but more than that. Brannigan hesitated, then continued with obvious reluctance. He thinks they know about you and Mabeth. He thinks they might be coming here. Elena felt ice form in her veins. Coming here? Why? Because of the letter Thomas wrote. Because they can't be sure he didn't tell you about what he discovered. Because you're a loose end they can't afford to leave untied. Elena stood up abruptly, panic clawing at her chest. Mabeth! Where is Mabeth? She's with the horses, Brannigan said, rising to follow her. Elena, wait. We need to think this through. But Elena was already running toward the barn, her mind filled with terrible possibilities. She had thought they were safe here, had believed that their worst troubles were behind them. Instead, she had unknowingly brought danger to the one place that had offered them sanctuary. She found Mabeth in Thunder's stall, brushing the big horse's coat with the careful attention Brannigan had taught her. The sight of her daughter, safe and content, made Elena's knees weak with relief. Mama? Mabeth looked up with concern. You look like you've seen a ghost. Elena gathered her daughter into her arms, holding her tightly. I need you to listen to me very carefully, sweetheart. We may need to leave the ranch for a while, just until some things are sorted out. Leave? Mabeth pulled back, her eyes wide with alarm. But why? What's wrong? Brannigan appeared in the barn doorway, his massive frame silhouetted against the afternoon light. Elena could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand rested unconsciously near where she now realized he probably carried a concealed weapon. Tell her the truth, he said quietly. She deserves to know what we're facing. Elena looked between her daughter and the man who had become so important to both of them. The truth was terrifying, but Brannigan was right. Mabeth was old enough to understand danger, and hiding it from her would only make things worse. Your father didn't die in an accident, Elena said slowly. He was killed by some very bad men who were stealing money from people like him, and now those men might be coming after us. Mabeth processed this with the serious concentration she brought to all important matters, because Papa found out what they were doing. Yes, and Mr. Brannigan is going to protect us? Elena looked at Brannigan, seeing in his face the same determination she had witnessed when he faced down Jake Morrison. Whatever his past mistakes, whatever had driven him to this isolated life, she knew with absolute certainty that he would not let anything happen to them. Yes, Brannigan said simply, I am. Then we're not leaving, Mabeth declared, with the fierce loyalty that had sustained them through their darkest hours. This is our home now. We don't run from bad people, we face them. Elena wanted to argue, wanted to insist that the safe choice was to flee, to hide, to put as much distance as possible between them and the threat that was coming. But as she looked at her daughter's determined face and Brannigan's steady gaze, she realized that running would solve nothing. These men would keep coming, would keep hunting, until they were stopped. What do we do? She asked Brannigan. He was quiet for a moment, and Elena could almost see the gears turning in his mind, the lawman's tactical thinking taking over from the rancher's peaceful routine. We prepare, he said finally. We turn this ranch into a fortress, and when they come, he paused, his pale eyes hard as winter stone, we end this once and for all. Elena felt a chill run down her spine at the promise in his voice. The gentleman who had been teaching her daughter about ranch life was gone, replaced by someone harder, more dangerous, someone who had worn a badge and faced down killers before, someone who would do whatever it took to keep his family safe. The word echoed in Elena's mind as she realized that somewhere along the way, that's what they had become, a family. Not bound by blood or law, but by something stronger, the choice to stand together against whatever darkness was coming for them. And as the three of them stood in the barn, united in their determination to fight rather than flee, Elena felt something she hadn't experienced since Thomas's death. The absolute certainty that whatever happened next, they would face it together. The transformation began immediately. Within hours of learning the truth about Thomas's death, the peaceful ranch that had become their sanctuary was evolving into something else entirely. Elena watched in fascination and growing unease as Colt Brannigan shed his rancher's persona and revealed the tactical mind of a man who had spent years hunting dangerous criminals. The first thing he did was retrieve a locked wooden cabinet from his bedroom, one that Elena had assumed contained ranch records or personal papers. Instead, when he opened it in the kitchen where she and Mabeth could see, it revealed an arsenal that spoke of a very different kind of life. Rifles, pistols, boxes of ammunition, and other equipment she didn't recognize, all meticulously maintained and organized with military precision. "Papa had a rifle," Mabeth said quietly, studying the weapons with the wide-eyed fascination of youth. "But nothing like this." "These aren't for hunting deer," Brannigan replied, his voice carrying the same patient tone he used when teaching her about ranch work. "These are tools for a different kind of job." Elena felt a chill as she watched him check each weapon with practiced efficiency. This was a side of him she had never seen, methodical, professional, deadly serious. The gentle man who had been teaching her daughter to brand cattle was gone, replaced by someone who moved with the controlled purpose of a predator preparing for battle. "How many of them are coming?" she asked. Brannigan consulted Marshal Morrison's letter again, his pale eyes scanning the details. "Frank estimates at least 4, maybe 6. The Prescott operation uses hired guns, men who are good with weapons but not particularly smart about tactics. They'll rely on intimidation and superior numbers. And you think you can handle 6 armed men by yourself?" Brannigan looked up from his preparations, and Elena saw something in his expression that was both reassuring and terrifying. "I've handled worse odds." The certainty in his voice left no room for doubt, but Elena found herself wondering what kind of life he had lived before coming to this ranch. How many dangerous men had he faced? How many fights had he survived? The gentle, patient man she had fallen in love with was still there, but underneath was something harder, a core of steel that had been forged in violence and tested in blood. "What do you need us to do?" she asked. "Learn to shoot," Brannigan replied without hesitation. "Both of you. If things go wrong, if something happens to me, you need to be able to defend yourselves." Elena felt her stomach lurch at the thought. She had never held a weapon in her life, had never imagined herself capable of violence. But as she looked at Mabeth's serious young face, she realized that motherhood had already taught her that she was capable of anything if it meant protecting her daughter. They spent the afternoon on the ridge behind the ranch house, where Brannigan had set up targets against a natural backstop of stone. He started with the basics: how to hold a pistol, how to sight down the barrel, how to squeeze the trigger smoothly rather than jerking it. "Shooting is like everything else worth doing," he told Mabeth as he guided her small hands into the proper grip. "It requires patience, concentration, and respect for what you're holding." Elena watched her daughter absorb the instruction with the same intense focus she brought to all of Brannigan's teaching. It was both admirable and heartbreaking. No 14-year-old should have to learn such skills, should have to prepare for the possibility of taking another person's life. When it was Elena's turn, she found the weight of the pistol both heavier and lighter than she had expected. Heavier with the knowledge of what it could do, lighter because of the sense of security it provided. "Remember," Brannigan said, standing close behind her as he adjusted her stance, "this isn't about being a gunfighter. This is about survival. If someone means to hurt you or Mabeth, you don't hesitate. You don't negotiate. You protect your family." The word hung in the air between them, family. Elena realized that Brannigan had claimed them as his own, had accepted the responsibility of protecting them, not just as a debt collector or even as a friend, but as something more fundamental. The knowledge made her heart race with emotions that had nothing to do with fear. By evening, both Elena and Mabeth could hit their targets with reasonable accuracy. It wasn't expert marksmanship, but it was enough to give them a fighting chance if the worst happened. As they cleaned the weapons together in the kitchen, Brannigan outlined his defensive plan. "They'll come at night, probably try to surround the house and force us out. The ranch house is built well, stone foundation, thick logs, good sight lines from the windows. If we're smart about it, we can make them come to us on our terms." "What if they just burn us out?" Elena asked. "They won't," Brannigan replied with confidence. "They need to be sure you're dead, need to recover any evidence Thomas might have left behind. Fire is too unpredictable. They can't be certain it would finish the job." Elena shuddered at his matter-of-fact discussion of their potential murder, but she forced herself to listen. Understanding their enemy's motivations might be the key to surviving them. "When will they come?" Mabeth asked. "Soon," Brannigan said. "Frank's letter was dated 5 days ago. If they left Denver right after Thomas's effects were discovered, they could be here by tomorrow night." The time frame sent a fresh wave of anxiety through Elena. Tomorrow night, less than 24 hours to prepare for a battle that would determine whether they lived or died. That evening, as they shared what might be their last peaceful dinner together, Elena found herself studying Brannigan's face in the lamplight. The careful reserve she had grown accustomed to was gone, replaced by a focused intensity that spoke of a man preparing for war. But underneath it, she could still see the gentle soul who had rescued them from desperation, who had given them a home when they had nowhere else to go. "Colt," she said suddenly, using his first name deliberately. "Before this happens, before whatever's coming arrives, I need to tell you something." He looked up from his plate, his pale eyes alert. "What is it?" Elena felt her cheeks warm, but she forced herself to continue. If they didn't survive the next few days, she didn't want to leave important things unsaid. "I love you," she said simply. "I know it complicates everything. I know it's not what either of us planned, but I needed you to know. Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that these weeks here have been the happiest I've had since Thomas died. You've given us more than just shelter, you've given us hope." Brannigan went very still, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth. Elena could see the conflict in his expression, surprise, pleasure, fear, and something that might have been relief, all warring for dominance. "Elena," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. You don't have to say anything," Elena interrupted gently. "I just wanted you to know." But Brannigan set down his fork and reached across the table to take her hand. His palm was warm and calloused, completely engulfing her smaller fingers. "I love you too," he said quietly. "Both of you. You've brought life back to this place, made it feel like a home instead of just a house. I was dying here before you came, dying of loneliness and old grief. You saved me as much as I saved you." Elena felt tears prick her eyes at his words. Across the table, Mabeth was beaming with unconcealed joy at this confirmation of what she had seen building between them for weeks. "So we're really going to be a family?" Mabeth asked, her voice bright with hope. "If we survive tomorrow," Brannigan said with gentle honesty, "then yes, we'll make it official marriage, adoption papers, the whole thing. But first, we have to get through what's coming." Elena squeezed his hand, drawing strength from the solid warmth of his presence. "We will. We have to." Later that night, as they made final preparations for the siege that was coming, Elena found herself thinking about the strange path that had brought them to this point. 6 weeks ago, she had been a desperate widow, offering her daughter to a stranger to settle a debt. Now, she was preparing to fight for her life alongside the man she loved, defending the home they had built together. The irony wasn't lost on her in trying to escape the consequences of Thomas's mistakes. She had unknowingly walked into the heart of the very conspiracy that had killed him. But she had also found something she hadn't dared to hope for, a second chance at love, at family, at happiness. As she checked the ammunition in her pistol one last time, Elena made a silent promise to whatever powers governed such things. She would fight for this life they had discovered together. She would protect her daughter and the man who had become their salvation, and she would not let the men who had destroyed her first family succeed in destroying her second. The ranch fell quiet as they settled in to wait for dawn and whatever it might bring. Elena lay in her bed, listening to the familiar sounds of the night wind through the cottonwoods, the distant lowing of cattle, the soft creak of the house settling around them. Tomorrow, those peaceful sounds might be replaced by gunfire and shouting, by violence and fear. But tonight, they were still a family preparing to defend their home, and that was worth fighting for, worth dying for if necessary. Elena drifted off to sleep with her pistol on the nightstand, and the sound of Colt's steady breathing from down the hall. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together. They would fight for the life they had built and the love they had found. And God willing, they would survive to see the dawn break over their valley once more, free and safe and whole. Elena woke to the sound that would haunt her dreams for years to come, the deep, resonant clang of the ranch bell that Brannigan had positioned near the barn. 3 measured strikes, then silence, then 3 more. It was the signal they had arranged, the warning that their enemies had finally arrived. She was dressed and armed within minutes, her hands steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. Down the hall, she could hear Mabeth moving with the same quiet urgency they had practiced. Whatever was coming, they were as ready as they could be. Elena found Brannigan at the front window of the main room, his rifle resting against the sill as he peered out into the pre-dawn darkness. His face was calm, focused, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. "How many?" she whispered. "5 that I can see," he replied without taking his eyes from the window. "Could be more. They're being careful, trying to surround the house before they make their move." Elena moved to the side window, where she had a clear view of the barn and the eastern approach to the ranch. At first, she saw nothing but shadows and familiar shapes. Then movement caught her eye, a figure darting between the outbuildings, keeping low and moving with practiced stealth. "There," she said quietly, pointing toward the barn. Brannigan followed her gaze and nodded grimly. "They're professionals, not the kind of men who make mistakes or give up easily." Mabeth appeared in the doorway, her pistol held with the careful grip Brannigan had taught her. Despite her youth, there was a steadiness about her that made Elena proud, even as it broke her heart. No child should have to face such violence, but Mabeth was proving herself equal to the challenge. "What do we do now?" she asked. "We wait," Brannigan replied. "Let them make the first move, show us what they're planning. The house gives us good cover and clear fields of fire. As long as we stay calm and stick to the plan, we have the advantage." Elena tried to draw comfort from his confidence, but her heart was racing as she watched more figures moving in the darkness around their home. These men had killed her husband, had tracked her across 3 territories, and now they were here to finish what they had started. The thought of what they might do to Mabeth if they succeeded made her grip her weapon tighter. A voice called out from the darkness, rough, commanding, used to being obeyed. "Mrs. Ward, we know you're in there. We don't want any trouble, just want to talk about your husband's business dealings." Elena felt a bitter laugh rise in her throat. These men had murdered Thomas, and now they wanted to talk about his business dealings. Brannigan motioned for silence, his eyes never leaving the window. Elena could see the tactical mind at work, assessing the situation, calculating odds and options. "Mrs. Ward," the voice called again, closer now. "We're not going away. Come out peaceful, and nobody else has to get hurt." "Nobody else?" Elena whispered angrily. "As if they haven't already." "Shh," Brannigan cautioned. "Let them keep talking. Every word tells us something about their position and their intentions." Elena bit back her response, forcing herself to think tactically rather than emotionally. Brannigan was right. These men were revealing information with every shout, every movement. "We know the marshal's been in touch," the voice continued. "We know about the letter. Just hand over any papers your husband left behind, and we'll be on our way." Elena exchanged glances with Brannigan. The men clearly didn't know that Thomas's evidence was already in the hands of law enforcement. They thought Elena might still have something that could incriminate them. "5 minutes, Mrs. Ward," the voice called. "Then we come in and get what we need." The ultimatum hung in the air like a death sentence. Elena felt Mabeth move closer to her, and she put her free arm around her daughter's shoulders. Whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine whether they lived to see another sunrise. Brannigan had moved away from the window, checking the other approaches to the house. "They're in position," he said quietly. "2 at the front, 2 at the back, 1 watching the side. Classic pincer movement." "Can we hold them off?" Elena asked. "We're about to find out." The silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Elena found herself counting her heartbeats, listening for any sound that might indicate the attack was beginning. The ranch bell sat silent now, having done its job of warning them. Then she heard it, the soft sound of footsteps on the front porch, someone trying to move quietly across the wooden boards. Elena's breath caught in her throat as she realized their enemies were making their move. "Get ready," Brannigan whispered, raising his rifle to his shoulder. The front door exploded inward with a crash that shook the entire house. Elena had expected it, had prepared for it, but the violence of the moment still made her heart stop. Dark figures poured through the doorway, and suddenly the peaceful home they had built together became a battlefield. Brannigan's rifle spoke first, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. Elena saw one of the intruders spin and fall, his weapon clattering across the floor. She forced herself to move, to think, to act, rather than simply react in terror. "The kitchen!" Brannigan shouted over the chaos. "Fall back to the kitchen!" Elena grabbed Mabeth's hand and ran, bullets splintering the walls around them as they sought the cover of the kitchen doorway. Behind them, she could hear Brannigan's measured gunfire, each shot calculated and precise. "Mama, I'm scared," Mabeth whispered, her young face pale but determined. "I know, sweetheart," Elena replied, checking her pistol with trembling hands. "Just remember what he taught us. Breathe, aim, squeeze gently." The sound of breaking glass came from the back of the house, more attackers coming through the windows. Elena realized with growing horror that they were being overwhelmed, that even Brannigan's skill might not be enough against so many enemies. "Elena," Brannigan's voice carried a note of urgency. "Kitchen window, 2 of them coming around the side." Elena moved to the window, seeing 2 figures approaching through the vegetable garden she had planted with such hope just weeks before. They were moving carefully but confidently, clearly experienced in this kind of work. She raised her pistol, trying to remember everything Brannigan had taught her about breathing and aiming. The first man was almost to the window when she pulled the trigger. The shot went wide, shattering glass but missing her target. "Breathe, Mama," Mabeth said quietly, "like he showed us." Elena steadied herself, drew a deep breath, and tried again. This time her shot found its mark, and the man stumbled backward, clutching his shoulder. Not a killing shot, but enough to slow him down. The second man raised his rifle toward the window, and Elena knew she didn't have time for another shot. She grabbed Mabeth and pulled them both away from the window, just as bullets shattered what remained of the glass. From the main room came the sounds of fierce fighting gunshots, breaking furniture, angry shouts. Elena's heart clenched with fear for Brannigan, but she forced herself to focus on protecting Mabeth. "Mrs. Ward," the rough voice was inside the house now, much closer than before. "This can end easy or hard. Your choice." Elena looked around the kitchen desperately, searching for options. They were trapped, outnumbered, running out of ammunition and time. But as her eyes fell on the ranch bell that was visible through the broken window, she remembered something Brannigan had told her about the signal. 3 strikes for danger approaching, 4 strikes for help needed. Elena grabbed the heavy iron poker from beside the stove and threw it through the window toward the bell with all her strength. The poker struck the bell with a resounding clang that echoed across the valley, 4 clear, desperate strikes that carried their plea for help into the darkness. "What are you doing?" Mabeth whispered. "Hoping," Elena replied, reloading her pistol with hands that shook despite her efforts to remain calm. The gunfire from the main room had stopped, and Elena felt ice form in her stomach. Either Brannigan had won, or she couldn't allow herself to complete that thought. "Colt?" she called softly. "I'm here." His voice came back, strained but strong. "2 down, but there are more outside." Elena felt relief flood through her. He was alive, still fighting. They still had a chance. But as she peered around the kitchen doorway, she could see that their situation was desperate. The house was damaged, their ammunition was running low, and their enemies showed no signs of giving up. Elena found herself praying to the God her mother's rosary represented, begging for salvation that might never come. And then, in the distance, she heard something that made her heart leap with hope, the sound of approaching hoofbeats, multiple riders moving fast toward the ranch. The bell had been heard. Help was coming. The question was whether it would arrive in time. The sound of approaching riders grew louder, and Elena heard shouting from outside the remaining attackers, realizing that their carefully planned assault was about to become a trap. Through the broken kitchen window, she could see muzzle flashes as the men outside engaged the approaching help. "Federal marshals," a voice shouted from the yard. "Drop your weapons." Elena felt a surge of hope so powerful it nearly brought her to her knees. Marshal Morrison had arrived, and he hadn't come alone. "Elena," Brannigan called from the main room, "stay down. This isn't over yet." She could hear the truth in his warning. The arrival of the marshals had changed the dynamic of the fight, but the men who had come to kill them weren't the type to surrender quietly. If anything, they would become more desperate, more dangerous. A figure appeared in the kitchen doorway, not Brannigan, but one of their attackers, his face twisted with rage and desperation. Elena didn't hesitate. She raised her pistol and fired, the shot taking the man in the chest and sending him backward into the main room. "Mama," Mabeth gasped, staring at what Elena had done. Elena looked at her daughter with steady eyes. "I protected our family," she said simply. "Sometimes that's what love requires." Mabeth nodded solemnly, understanding in that moment something about the world that Elena wished she never had to learn. The gunfire outside was intensifying, but Elena could tell that the tide of battle was turning. The marshals had numbers and position on their side, and the attackers were caught in the open with nowhere to run. "Mrs. Ward," the rough voice that had been taunting them earlier now carried a note of desperation. "I've got something that belongs to you." Elena felt her blood freeze as she recognized what the man was threatening. She moved carefully to where she could see into the main room, and her worst fears were confirmed. One of the attackers had Brannigan at gunpoint, using him as a human shield as he backed toward the front door. "Let him go," Elena called out, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her chest. "Can't do that, ma'am," the man replied, "but I'll make you a deal. You come out here with any papers your husband left behind, and I'll let your man live." Elena looked at Brannigan, seeing in his pale eyes the same message he had been trying to send her all along. "Don't sacrifice yourself for me." But Elena had already made her choice. She had lost one husband to these men. She would not lose another. From her pocket, she withdrew the blood-stained letter that had started this whole nightmare. Thomas's final warning, his attempt to expose the conspiracy that had killed him. It was the only evidence they had, the only thing that could bring justice for her husband's murder. "Here," she said, stepping into view with the letter in her hand. "This is what you want." The man's eyes lit up with triumph as he saw the paper. "Bring it over here, nice and slow." Elena began walking toward him, acutely aware of the gun pointed at Brannigan's head. Every step felt like an eternity, every breath a gift that might be her last. "That's far enough," the man said when she was halfway across the room. "Toss it over." Elena hesitated, looking into Brannigan's eyes one last time. In them, she saw love, regret, and something else, a warning. His gaze flicked almost imperceptibly toward the window, and Elena understood. Instead of throwing the letter to the gunman, she flung it toward the broken window, where the morning breeze caught it and carried it out into the yard. The man cursed and instinctively turned toward the escaping evidence, loosening his grip on Brannigan for just a moment. It was all the opening Brannigan needed. He spun in the man's grasp, striking upward with his elbow and sending the gun flying. The two men crashed to the floor, grappling for control. Elena raised her pistol, but they were rolling and fighting too close together for her to risk a shot. She could only watch in terrified helplessness as the man she loved fought for his life against a killer who had nothing left to lose. The fight seemed to last forever, though it was probably only seconds. Both men were strong and experienced, but Brannigan had the advantage of fighting for something more than just his own survival. When it was over, the attacker lay still, and Brannigan was slowly getting to his feet, bloodied but alive. "It's over," he said quietly, looking around the destroyed room that had been their peaceful home just hours before. Outside, the gunfire had stopped. Elena could hear Marshal Morrison shouting orders, the sounds of men being arrested, the controlled chaos that followed a successful operation. Through the window, she could see the morning sun breaking over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. They had survived. Elena ran to Brannigan, throwing her arms around him despite his injuries. He held her tightly, and she could feel the tremor in his hands that spoke of how close they had all come to death. "The letter," Elena said suddenly, remembering. "I threw it outside." "I have it," came a voice from the doorway. Marshal Frank Morrison stood there, holding the blood-stained paper that had caused so much death and destruction. He was a tall, lean man with graying hair and eyes that had seen too much violence. "One of my men retrieved it from the yard." Elena sagged with relief. The evidence was safe. Thomas's killers would face justice, and the nightmare that had started with her husband's death might finally be over. "Mrs. Ward," Morrison continued, "I owe you an apology. We should have moved faster, should have gotten to you before they did." "You came when it mattered," Elena replied. "That's what counts." Morrison looked around the damaged room, taking in the bullet holes and broken furniture, the evidence of the battle that had been fought here. "This was your home," he said with genuine regret. "It still is," Brannigan said firmly, his arm tightening around Elena's shoulders. "A home isn't about the building, it's about the people in it." Elena looked up at him, seeing in his battered face the man she had fallen in love with, the protector who had risked everything to keep her and Maybeth safe. Damaged furniture could be replaced, broken windows could be repaired, but the love they had built together, the family they had become, that was precious beyond measure. "Mama," Maybeth said from where she had been standing quietly in the kitchen doorway, "are we really safe now?" Morrison nodded solemnly. "The Prescott conspiracy is finished, young lady. We've rounded up the last of them, and they'll be facing federal charges for murder and fraud. Your father's death will be avenged." Elena felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness at his words. Justice for Thomas was important, but it couldn't bring him back or undo the suffering his death had caused. What mattered now was the future, the life she and Maybeth and Brannigan would build together. "Marshal," Brannigan said, "I assume you'll be needing statements from all of us." "Eventually," Morrison replied. "But first, you all need to rest, to heal from what you've been through. The paperwork can wait." As the marshal left to supervise the cleanup outside, Elena found herself alone with her family in the wreckage of their home. It should have been a moment of pure relief, but instead, she felt oddly empty, as if the intense focus required for survival had left her drained of emotion. "Elena," Brannigan said softly, "are you all right?" She looked around the room, where they had shared meals and conversations, where they had begun to build a life together. The damage seemed almost symbolic, the old life destroyed, but the foundation still strong enough to build upon. "I will be," she said finally. "We all will be, From her pocket, she withdrew her mother's rosary, fingering the familiar beads as she offered a silent prayer of gratitude. They had faced the darkness and emerged into the light. They had fought for their family and won. Now came the harder task, learning to live with what they had done, learning to heal from what they had endured, learning to trust in the peace they had fought so hard to achieve. But as Elena looked at the faces of the man and daughter she loved, she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would meet them together. They were a family forged in fire, tempered by adversity, stronger for having survived the worst that life could throw at them. The sun was fully up now, flooding the damaged room with golden light. It was the dawn of a new day, a new beginning, a new chance at happiness. And Elena Ward, soon to be Elena Brannigan, was ready to embrace whatever the future might hold. 6 months later, Elena stood on the front porch of the ranch house, watching the sun set over the valley that had become her home in every sense of the word. The house bore no traces of the violence that had once shattered its peace. Colt had repaired the damage with meticulous care, turning the restoration into a labor of love that seemed to heal more than just broken wood and glass. The sound of laughter drifted from the barn, where Maybeth was teaching her new father the finer points of grooming Thunder's coat. Elena smiled at the easy camaraderie between them, marveling at how naturally they had settled into their roles as daughter and father. The adoption papers had been finalized just last week, making official what had been true in their hearts for months. "Mrs. Brannigan," a familiar voice said behind her, and Elena turned to see her husband approaching with 2 cups of coffee and the satisfied expression of a man who had spent the day working on his own land. "Mr. Brannigan," she replied with mock formality, accepting the coffee and moving aside so he could join her on the porch swing he had built for their wedding day. The ceremony had been small and simple, held in the same church in Coyote Bend, where Elena had prayed for guidance during those dark weeks of uncertainty. Marshal Morrison had given her away, and Maybeth had served as her maid of honor, beaming with joy throughout the entire service. The townspeople who had once gossiped about their arrangement now spoke of them as one of the most devoted couples in the territory. "Good day," Elena asked, settling against Colt's side with the comfortable ease of 2 people who had found their perfect fit. "Very good," he replied, his arm encircling her shoulders. "The new calves are thriving. The south pasture fence is finally finished, and I got a letter from Frank Morrison with some interesting news." Elena looked up at him curiously. "What kind of news?" "The Prescott conspirators were all convicted, life sentences for the murders, including Thomas's. The ringleaders will never see freedom again." Elena felt a complex mixture of emotions at the news. Relief that justice had been served, satisfaction that Thomas's death had been avenged, but also a kind of closure that allowed her to fully release the grief and anger she had carried for so long. "Good," she said simply. "Thomas can rest in peace now." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the evening sounds of the ranch settling around them. It was a different kind of peace than Elena had known in her first marriage, deeper, more grounded, built on shared trials and mutual understanding rather than youthful passion and dreams. "Colt," she said eventually, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had never come to collect that debt? If we had never met?" He was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the thoughtfulness she had come to love about him. "I think," he said finally, "that I would have stayed alone in this beautiful place, growing old and bitter without ever understanding what I was missing. And you and Maybeth would have found some other way to survive, because that's who you are, survivors." "But we wouldn't have found this," Elena said, gesturing toward the home they had built together. "No," Colt agreed. "We wouldn't have found this." From the barn came the sound of Maybeth's voice, raised in the song she had been teaching herself from an old hymnal. The melody drifted across the yard like a benediction, sweet and pure and full of hope for the future. "She's happy," Elena observed, watching her daughter through the barn door. "She's home," Colt corrected gently. "We all are." Elena reached into her pocket and withdrew the new family portrait they had commissioned from a traveling photographer just last week. The three of them stood together in front of the ranch house, Colt's massive frame protective and proud, Elena radiant in her best dress, and Mabeth between them, with her father's steady gaze and her mother's gentle smile. The photograph would replace the empty frame that had sat on the mantelpiece for so long, filling that vacant space with the family Colt had always dreamed of, and Elena had feared she would never find again. "I love you," she said, the words still carrying the wonder of someone who had been given a second chance at happiness. "I love you too," Colt replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Both of you, more than I ever thought possible." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Elena reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. She had begun as a desperate widow, offering her daughter to settle a debt, had become a woman fighting for her life against killers, and had emerged as the wife and mother she was always meant to be. The road had been hard, marked by loss and fear, and moments when survival itself seemed impossible. But it had led them here, to this place of peace and love and belonging. It had taught them that family was not just about blood or law, but about the choice to stand together against whatever challenges life might bring. Tomorrow would bring new tasks, new joys, new challenges to face together. The ranch would continue to grow and prosper under their combined efforts. Mabeth would continue to blossom into the remarkable woman she was destined to become, and Elena and Colt would continue to build their life together, day by day, season by season, year by year. But tonight, as they sat together on their porch watching their daughter sing in the barn while the first stars appeared overhead, Elena felt a contentment so profound it seemed to fill every corner of her being. This was what Thomas had died trying to provide, not just financial security, but the deeper wealth that came from being truly loved and completely safe. The ranch that had once echoed with loneliness now hummed with life and purpose. The empty rooms upstairs had been transformed, one into Mabeth's sanctuary, decorated with wildflowers and the books Colt had ordered from Denver, another into Elena's sewing room, where she created the curtains and quilts that had turned the house into a true home. Even the bunkhouse had been reopened, housing the two ranch hands Colt had hired to help with the expanding operation. Jake Morrison's dire warnings about community acceptance had proven unfounded. Their neighbors had embraced the Brannigan family with the warmth reserved for those who had proven themselves through adversity. "Mama, Papa," Mabeth called from the barn, using the name she had naturally begun calling Colt after the adoption. "Come see what Thunder learned today." Elena and Colt exchanged amused glances. Their daughter had inherited not just Thomas's love of learning, but also Colt's natural affinity for animals. Under his patient guidance, she had become an accomplished horsewoman and a gifted trainer, coaxing remarkable performances from creatures that had seemed impossible to manage. They walked hand in hand to the barn, where Mabeth demonstrated Thunder's new ability to respond to subtle hand signals rather than vocal commands. The massive stallion moved with grace and precision, following Mabeth's gestures with the devotion of a creature that knew itself loved and valued. "Remarkable," Colt said, his voice filled with genuine pride. "You've got a gift, daughter. Thunder trusts you completely." Elena watched the interaction with a heart full of gratitude. This was what family looked like, not perfect people living perfect lives, but imperfect people choosing to love each other through whatever storms might come. Mabeth had gained not just a stepfather, but a teacher, mentor, and protector who saw her potential and nurtured it with infinite patience. As they walked back to the house together, Mabeth chattering about her plans for training the new foals that would arrive in spring, Elena caught sight of movement on the ridge above the ranch. For just a moment, the old fear clawed at her chest, more men coming with violence in their hearts. But these were different figures, a small herd of deer, picking their way delicately across the meadow, pausing to drink from the stream that wound through their property. Wildlife had returned to the valley in abundance, as if sensing that this was once again a place of peace rather than conflict. "Look," Elena said softly, pointing toward the ridge. They stood together in the yard, three people who had found each other across impossible odds, watching the deer move like shadows against the star-filled sky. It was a moment of perfect tranquility, the kind that made all the struggle and fear seem worthwhile. Later that night, after Maybeth had gone to bed with a book of poetry Colt had given her for her 15th birthday, Elena and Colt sat together in their bedroom, planning the expansion of the ranch that would accommodate the family they hoped to grow. Elena's hand rested on her still flat stomach, where new life had begun just weeks before a secret they were keeping until they could be certain. A joy too precious to share before its time. "Do you think she'll be happy about a baby brother or sister?" Elena asked. "Are you asking because you're worried or because you want reassurance?" Colt replied with a gentle humor that had become one of the things she loved most about him. "Both," Elena admitted. Colt pulled her closer, his large hand covering hers protectively. "She'll be thrilled. She's been hinting for months about wanting a bigger family. I think she sees it as her chance to be the wise older sister, passing on everything we've taught her." Elena smiled at the image of Maybeth as a protective big sister, teaching their future children the same lessons about ranch life and family loyalty that Colt had taught her. The continuity of it, the way their love was already reaching forward to embrace children not yet born, filled her with wonder. "We're going to need a bigger table," she observed, thinking of family dinners with additional chairs, additional voices, additional love to go around. "We'll build whatever we need," Colt said with the confidence of a man who had learned that with patience and determination, any dream could become reality. Room by room, year by year, as the family grows. Elena closed her eyes and let herself imagine it: birthdays and holidays, first steps and first words, the ranch house filled with the sounds of children playing and learning and growing. It was a future that seemed almost too good to be true, but she had learned to trust in the possibility of happiness. As sleep began to claim her, Elena's last conscious thought was of the empty picture frame that now held their family portrait, and of all the frames yet to be filled with the memories they would make together. The broken star that gave the ranch its name had proven prophetic. Sometimes things that seemed irreparably damaged could be made whole again, stronger and more beautiful for having survived the breaking. In the morning, they would wake to another day of shared purpose and quiet contentment. There would be cattle to tend and fences to mend, lessons to teach and love to share. There would be the 1,000 small tasks and pleasures that made up a life well lived. But tonight, Elena Brannigan fell asleep in the arms of the man who had saved her and the daughter she had protected, in the home they had defended and the peace they had earned. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring, but tonight all was well in their corner of the world. The circle was complete, the debt was paid, the family was whole.